Protests in Nigeria have been a significant aspect of the country's socio-political landscape, reflecting the public's response to various issues such as political corruption, police brutality, economic hardship, and social injustices. Among the numerous protests, the EndSARS movement stands out as one of the most notable in recent history. Here's an overview of Nigeria's protests with a focus on the EndSARS movement. Background. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, has a rich history of activism and protest. The country's journey from colonial rule to independence in 1960 was marked by various forms of resistance and activism. Post-independence, Nigeria has witnessed a series of military coups, civil unrest, and protests driven by various grievances. Among these, protests against government corruption, poor governance, and human rights abuses have been particularly prominent. The EndSARS movement. The EndSARS movement emerged as a response to widespread allegations of brutality, extortion, and extrajudicial killings by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad SARS, a unit of the Nigerian police force. Established in 1992 to combat armed robbery and other serious crimes, SARS became notorious for its severe human rights abuses. Early protests. Protests against SARS date back to at least 2017, but they gained significant momentum in October 2020. The movement was fueled by social media, with the hashtag EndSARS trending globally. Young Nigerians, who formed the core of the movement, organized and mobilized through platforms like Twitter, demanding the disbandment of SARS and broader police reforms. Escalation. The protests quickly spread across major cities in Nigeria, including Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. Demonstrators not only called for the disbandment of SARS, but also highlighted broader issues such as corruption, unemployment, and the need for good governance. Peaceful protests were met with varying degrees of resistance from security forces, with reports of violence and intimidation. Government response. On October 11, 2020, in response to the growing protests, the Nigerian government announced the dissolution of SARS. However, protesters were skeptical, citing previous instances where similar promises had been made but not implemented. The movement's demands evolved to include justice for victims of police brutality, the release of arrested protesters, and comprehensive police reforms. The Lekki toll gate incident. The turning point of the EndSARS protests occurred on October 20, 2020, when security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters at the Lekki toll gate in Lagos. The incident, which came to be known as the Lekki Massacre, resulted in multiple casualties and sparked outrage both nationally and internationally. Despite denials from the government and military, multiple eyewitness accounts and video footage substantiated the claims of excessive force used against peaceful protesters. The EndSARS movement had significant and lasting impacts on Nigerian society and governance. 1. Increased awareness and engagement. The movement heightened awareness of police brutality and human rights abuses in Nigeria. It also galvanized a generation of young Nigerians to become more politically engaged and active in demanding accountability from their leaders. 2. Government reforms. While the government announced the disbandment of SARS, the movement pushed for broader reforms. In response, various states set up judicial panels of inquiry to investigate cases of police brutality and provide compensation to victims. However, many activists remain skeptical about the implementation and effectiveness of these measures. 3. Global solidarity. The protests received widespread international attention and support, with global figures and organizations expressing solidarity with Nigerian protesters. This international spotlight pressured the Nigerian government to address the issues raised by the movement. 4. Legacy of resistance. The End SARS movement left a lasting legacy of resistance and advocacy for justice in Nigeria. It demonstrated the power of social media in mobilizing and organizing protests and highlighted the importance of peaceful, sustained activism in effecting change. Broader context. The End SARS movement is part of a broader pattern of protests in Nigeria's history. Other notable protests include the Occupy Nigeria protests 2012. Triggered by the government's removal of fuel subsidies, these protests highlighted issues of economic hardship and government corruption. Protests against military rule. During Nigeria's periods of military dictatorship, various pro-democracy movements and protests demanded a return to civilian rule. Protests in Nigeria, including the End SARS movement, reflect the resilience and determination of the Nigerian people to demand justice, accountability, and good governance. These movements have significantly shaped Nigeria's political landscape and continue to inspire ongoing efforts for reform and social change.